Hi, I'm Dr. David Purves. In this film, I'm talking about how to step out of negative feelings and negative thoughts. Have you ever heard people say, I was in the zone? Obviously, there's this thing called the zone, which people consider to be a good thing. Like, I was in the zone, man. It was fantastic. I felt great in the zone. He was really playing in the zone then. So clearly, that's my American accent, by the way. So clearly, there is a psychological place called the zone that people like to be in. But I was wondering, do you think it's likely that there is a negative zone? Well, it's possible. But what is the zone? Well, clearly the zone involves what I would consider to be a narrowed focus, maybe even a tunnel vision, and certainly an intense concentration on a particular thing, on a particular task. And often people, claim to be in the zone when they're doing things like scuba diving and rock climbing. And in fact, when I used to scuba dive, time passes very, very quickly. And it's surprising how much you've achieved in what seems like such a short period of time. That's very zone-like in many respects. But how would you know that you were in a bad zone? Well, I guess you'd have the consequences of being in a bad zone. You'd feel not very happy, probably anxious or worried. You'd feel that you'd lost some control. You'd probably feel a bit as if you weren't able to make things happen as you wanted them to happen. Probably feel a bit helpless, possibly feel a bit hopeless. Certainly feel like your possibilities and potential has been narrowed and limited, as if there just isn't the opportunity that there used to be. These would all be characteristics, in my opinion, of being in a bad zone. So, a bad zone is, in a sense, an opposite, gives you the opposite outcome from a good zone, but the process is probably very, very similar. Tunnel vision, narrowed, intense concentration. Let's have a little look specifically at what I consider to be examples of being in a bad zone. I had a car crash. I should be very afraid on the roads. Roads are really dangerous right now. I saw someone getting told off at work. I should really be very careful. I bet they're going to sack everybody. I'm bound to lose my job if I get told off. I really got to watch my P's and Q's. People judge other people. I'll be judged and found out. It's only a matter of time before I find out that I'm not as good as they thought I was. I couldn't bear it if something bad happened to people that I loved and cared about. I've got to try and make sure everybody is as safe as it possibly can be. I've got to control everything. I've got to manage everything so that nothing bad can happen because I couldn't bear it. I don't feel good enough. I've got to work harder and harder. I've got to work harder than anyone else. I've got to do better than anyone else. Everything I do has to be perfect, otherwise it's going to be an absolute disaster. Have you ever wondered why politicians never answer the question that they're asked? Well, the reason is that they don't want to accept the assumption inherent in the question, because all questions have assumptions within them. So, for instance, why didn't the last Labour government adequately manage the banking crisis? There is the assumption in that question that the last Labour government didn't adequately manage the banking crisis. So if you answer the question, you're accepting the assumption. Why doesn't the current government care more about the environment? There's the assumption that the current government doesn't care enough about the environment. If you answer that question, you're accepting the assumption. Why doesn't the church do more to help people who really need help? If you answer that question, you're accepting the assumption that the church doesn't do enough to help people who really need help. But of course, politicians and kind of community leaders never want to accept the premise, the assumption within the question, because it's loaded. Every question comes from a particular ideological viewpoint. But when we go into a bad zone, when we go into this tunnel perspective, we accept the assumptions that we find within that place, and we never normally challenge them. I had a car crash. It doesn't mean that I have to be very frightened on roads. It doesn't mean that roads are more risky than they ever were, and it doesn't mean that I actually have to be fearful and to change my behavior. Now, fair enough, I might drive a little bit more carefully, and probably we could all do well to drive a little bit more carefully, but it doesn't mean that fear is a logical response to having had a car accident. People do judge other people, and there are some very judgmental people in the world. But just because someone's judgmental, it doesn't mean that I will be found wanting if they judge me. It doesn't mean that I have flaws, faults, and failings that this judgmental person can pick up. And in fact, even if I'm criticized, it doesn't mean that the criticism is accurate. I have to add something to it to make a criticism personally hurtful. I have to actually engage in the assumptions of the criticism for it to be hurtful. I might not feel good enough, but that doesn't mean that I'm not good enough. Facts are not feelings, and just because I feel something doesn't necessarily mean that it accurately reflects who I genuinely am. When we find ourselves in the bad zone, we typically don't challenge these negative assumptions, and that's why we have the emotional consequences, feeling that we don't have enough control, or that somehow our life's stalled, it's not going the way we want it to go. We don't have enough options. So if you think about it, the zone narrows your attention, the good zone, narrows your attention onto a task that you want to accomplish well. The bad zone narrows your attention, but it narrows your attention so that you never challenge these negative assumptions, and you just therefore experience the negative feelings that go along with them. So what we need to do is we need to gain more perspective on our bad zone. We need to, in essence, drag ourselves out of the tunnel, drag ourselves out of the bad zone. And we can do that by a process that I call triangulation. Basically, the bad zone is like a narrow corridor. We have the basic statement there, I had a car crash. Then we have the assumption, I need to be very afraid. We never challenge that. Consequently, I feel very afraid. But when we triangulate it, it gives us some context that enables us to put things in perspective. I had a crash. Well, I can be careful, but the risk is no more now than it was before the crash. And in fact, there's a lot of value to being able to drive comfortably on the roads, and I do 30,000 miles a year. So actually, my brain's probably overestimating the risk, and you know what? I'm just as safe as ever I was. That is a triangulated set of statements that pull me out of the zone. The zone being, I had a crash, I should be very afraid. I saw someone getting told off. Well, the zone would say, I should be very careful and I've got to be watchful and wary. But the triangulated approach says, just because someone got told off doesn't mean that I'm going to get told off. Just because they did something wrong doesn't mean I'm going to do something wrong. Plus, I don't know what they did. Plus, I don't know the state of mind, the mood of the person who was telling them off. And I actually don't know the context at all. So in fact, I have very little information to make a valid and accurate judgment. Sure, people do judge other people. But just because people judge people doesn't mean that their judgment is valid, accurate, or worthwhile. Many people are prejudiced, which is a form of judgment, but doesn't mean that their prejudice is accurate, worthwhile, or even useful to them or anyone else. Just because people judge people, I'm not wanting, doesn't mean that I'm incompetent. In fact, I'm probably competent, capable, and worthwhile. So we have to put context into our bad zone. We've got to lasso ourselves and pull ourselves out of this narrow bad zone so that we have a triangulated contextual approach. This means that we then can see the options which actually exist, but which normally are blocked off from us. When you triangulate, you give yourself the opportunity to be more in control and to have more freedom. Now, as with all psychological processes, particularly ones where you're going against a habit or an ingrained pattern of activity, it's always good to have a little motto to remind you what you're trying to achieve. So I've created this one. No control without context. No control without context. When you put yourself in the context, when you triangulate whatever problem or whatever assumption that you're dealing with, it gives you more control because it gives you more options. You don't have to accept the assumption that's in the zone. There are alternative explanations that you could profitably use, and it would help you to feel as if you have more control. So no control without context. Flip it on its head. No context, no control. Bad zone. Turn it around. No control without context. Give yourself a contextual perspective, give yourself a different viewpoint, and you have lots more options, hence you feel you have a lot more control. I hope you found this information interesting and potentially useful. Try the exercise, try to triangulate the things that you struggle with. It takes a little bit of practice, but you know what? There isn't really an alternative if you want to get out of the bad zone. I'm Dr. David Purves.